St. Peter's Basilica is the physical and symbolic heart of the entire Catholic Church. The site traditionally understood to sit above St. Peter's own burial place, and the backdrop for countless moments we've covered throughout this channel. But building it took an almost unbelievable amount of time, roughly 120 years from the laying of the first new foundation stone to the building's eventual consecration, spanning the reigns of more than 20 different popes and involving a genuinely remarkable rotating cast of the most significant architects in Renaissance and early Baroque history. This video is about why it took so long and what happened along the way. Welcome to Pope Pulse. This continues our deep dive into Catholic Church history and art. Let's start with why an entirely new basilica was needed in the first place. The basilica standing today isn't the first church built on this specific site. An earlier basilica, commissioned by the Roman Emperor Constantine in the 4th century, had stood on the same location for over 1,000 years, itself built directly above the traditional site of Peter's burial, a connection we discussed in our earlier video on the origins of the papacy. By the 15th century, however, this original structure had fallen into a genuinely serious state of physical disrepair, with structural problems including a dangerously leaning wall that raised real concerns among church officials about the building's long-term safety and stability. Various popes discussed the possibility of major renovations or a full replacement across the mid to late 15th century, but it was Pope Julius II, whom we discussed in our earlier Sistine Chapel video, who ultimately committed decisively to a complete, ground-up reconstruction rather than continued patchwork repair, formally beginning construction in 1506. Julius selected the architect Donato Bramante to design the new basilica, and Bramante's original vision called for an enormous structure built on a Greek cross floor plan, meaning 4 equal arms extending from a central point, topped by a massive central dome, a design deeply influenced by classical Roman architectural principles that Bramante had studied extensively. Bramante's ambitious design earned him the nickname Bramante Ruinante, a somewhat unflattering pun in Italian roughly meaning Bramante the Ruiner, reportedly because of his willingness to demolish significant portions of the older existing basilica and other surrounding structures more aggressively than some contemporaries felt was strictly necessary in pursuit of his ambitious new vision. Construction proceeded relatively slowly during this initial phase, and Bramante died in 1514, only 8 years into the project, leaving the basilica's ultimate design and completion considerably unresolved and open to revision by whoever succeeded him. What followed Bramante's death was a genuinely remarkable, decades-long sequence of different architects taking over the project, each bringing distinct design revisions, priorities, and, in several cases, outright disagreement with their predecessor's approach. Raphael, already renowned as a painter and whom we briefly mentioned in our Sistine Chapel video, took over as chief architect after Bramante's death and proposed shifting the floor plan toward a Latin cross design, with one arm longer than the other 3, before his own death in 1520 left the project once again without a clear, settled direction. Several additional architects followed over subsequent decades, including Antonio da Sangallo the Younger, who worked on the project for over 2 decades but died before construction reached a genuinely definitive, final form. Then, in 1546, at the advanced age of 71, Michelangelo, already famous for his earlier work on the Sistine Chapel ceiling decades before, was appointed chief architect by Pope Paul III. Michelangelo significantly revised the design once again, returning closer to Bramante's original centralized Greek cross concept while introducing his own distinctive structural and aesthetic innovations, and he remained deeply involved with the project for roughly the final 2 decades of his own long life, right up until his death in 1564, though the basilica's iconic dome itself wasn't actually completed until decades after Michelangelo's own death. Michelangelo developed detailed designs and models for the basilica's massive dome before his death, but he did not live to see it actually built. The dome was eventually completed based substantially on his design by the architect Giacomo della Porta, working alongside Domenico Fontana, with construction on the dome itself proceeding rapidly between 1588 and 1590 under Pope Sixtus V, who pushed the project forward with genuinely unusual urgency and available resources compared to some of the more sporadic progress of earlier decades. The completed dome remains, to this day, the tallest dome in the world measured to its outer cross, and it's generally regarded as one of the single most significant engineering and architectural achievements of the entire Renaissance and early Baroque period, combining Michelangelo's original structural and aesthetic vision with the practical engineering solutions that Della Porta and Fontana developed to actually make that ambitious vision physically achievable at the scale required. Even with the dome completed by 1590, the basilica as a whole wasn't yet finished. Pope Paul V commissioned the architect Carlo Maderno in the early 17th century to extend the building's floor plan further, adding the basilica's current, considerably elongated nave and its iconic facade, the wide, columned front exterior that most visitors actually see first when approaching the building today. This particular addition proved genuinely controversial among some contemporary and later architectural critics, since extending the nave meant departing further from Bramante's and Michelangelo's original centralized Greek cross vision. Moving instead toward the elongated Latin cross floor plan the basilica retains today. Despite this ongoing design debate among architects and historians, the basilica was formally consecrated by Pope Urban VIII in 1626, exactly 120 years after Julius II had first laid the new foundation stone back in 1506, finally bringing this genuinely extraordinary multi-generational construction project to its official completion. John Lorenzo Bernini's famous colonnade, the sweeping, curved rows of columns embracing the piazza in front of the basilica that most people picture when they think of St. Peter's Square today, was actually added considerably later still, completed across the 1650s and 1660s, decades after the basilica itself had already been formally consecrated. Stepping back, a few clear factors explain why this specific project stretched across so many decades and so many different popes and architects, well beyond what any single individual involved could have originally anticipated at the outset. The sheer physical scale of the undertaking was, for its era, genuinely unprecedented, requiring engineering solutions, particularly for the dome, that pushed considerably beyond what had been reliably achieved before at comparable scale anywhere in Europe. Funding also fluctuated considerably depending on each individual pope's specific priorities, the broader Vatican's finances at any given moment, and occasionally significant political and religious disruption across Europe more broadly, including the Reformation-era upheaval we referenced in our earlier Sistine Chapel video, which affected church finances and priorities more broadly during parts of this same extended construction period. And finally, the project's design itself was never fully settled for any single sustained period until relatively late in the overall process, with each successive architect bringing genuinely different structural and aesthetic priorities, sometimes significantly revising or even reversing major elements of their predecessor's existing work. This combination of unprecedented scale, fluctuating funding, and repeatedly evolving design vision, more than any single specific individual delay, explains why this particular building took considerably longer than nearly any other major construction project in the church's entire history. So the next time you see St. Peter's Basilica in our coverage of a papal mass, a conclave announcement, or any other major Vatican event, remember there's this entire century-plus, multi-generational construction story behind it. A building whose final form reflects the accumulated, sometimes conflicting vision of history's greatest Renaissance and Baroque architects, refined and revised across more than 100 years and more than 20 separate papal reigns. If you're enjoying this deep dive into Vatican history and architecture, subscribe to Pope Pulse for more, and let me know in the comments. Did the full timeline surprise you, or had you already known just how long this particular building actually took?